Welcome to The Explainer, where we break down complex stories into clear, dynamic presentations. Today, we're digging into a term that wasn't just a piece of misinformation, it became a weapon in the information wars.
You've probably seen it online, turbo cancer. I mean, the name itself is designed to grab you, to scare you. But let's get one thing straight, right from the very beginning. Turbo cancer is not a real medical diagnosis. It's a story, a narrative, cooked up to give a simple answer to a very complex and frightening topic.
So the big question is, how does a completely made-up medical term become a global talking point? Well, in this explainer, we're going to perform an autopsy on this myth. We're going to trace its journey from a fringe theory all the way to a geopolitical tool.
So where did this all start? To really understand the myth, you have to look at the environment where it first took root. Because like any powerful idea, good or bad, it needed just the right conditions to grow.
You see, turbo cancer didn't just appear out of nowhere. It's really just the latest chapter in an ever-evolving story of fear. Think back to 2021. The anxiety was all about control, right? Magnets, microchips, 5G. When that stuff didn't happen, the story shifted in 2022 to more immediate dangers, like blood clots. But as time went on and millions of people were fine, the narrative needed a new, scarier villain, something slower, more insidious. And cancer, well, with its long, terrifying timeline, it was the perfect next step for the story.
And here's where the myth got its first real foothold. It latched onto a real-world tragedy. During the pandemic, millions of us missed or delayed routine cancer screenings. So, by the time many people finally got to a doctor, their cancers were diagnosed at a later, more aggressive stage. This created a huge, terrifying mystery, a gap of understanding. And the turbo cancer myth was right there to fill that gap with a simple, direct, and completely false explanation. Now, this wasn't some random idea bubbling up from the public. No, this narrative was carefully built and promoted by a handful of people playing a very specific role, the rogue doctor archetype. They used their medical credentials to make these claims sound legit, coining the scary term based on their own stories, claiming to see wildfire cancers in their labs, and building these online echo chambers of fear.
And to make it all sound scientific, they used a very specific toolkit of distortion. For example, they'd take a report about a single mouse, one mouse, that developed lymphoma, and wave it around as proof, totally ignoring that the study's own authors said it didn't prove a thing. They also dug up an old scare about something called the SV40 monkey cancer virus. But the reality? The vaccines only contain tiny, harmless DNA fragments of an SV40 promoter. Think of it like a discarded piece of a recipe, not the dangerous ingredient itself.
So you've got this fringe idea, built on some seriously shaky science. How on earth did it break out and go globally viral? The answer isn't in a biology lab, it's in the digital architecture of our social media feeds.
What's so wild here is how each platform became the perfect petri dish for this myth to grow. On X, formerly Twitter, it was all about outrage and controversy. That's what the algorithm loves. TikTok became the home for raw, gut-wrenching emotion, using these heartbreaking videos to completely bypass our rational minds. And Facebook's private groups? They created these sealed-off bubbles where the myth was repeated so often it started to feel like an undeniable truth. Let's just zero in on TikTok for a second. The most powerful tool there was the before and after video. You know the ones. A photo of a healthy smiling person, then bam, a video of them in a hospital bed. This is a classic psychological trick. It's called the identifiable victim effect. We are just hardwired to feel more for one person's specific story than we are for a mountain of statistics that show the opposite. One tragic story just feels more real than data from millions of healthy people.
And then the parasites arrived. Foreign state operations saw this viral fear and decided to hijack it for their own goals. You had Russian operations called Doppelganger that cloned Western news sites to push narratives designed to sow chaos and division. At the same time, Chinese networks, known as Spamiflage, were trying to degrade the West's reputation, pushing the idea that its technology was a failure, which, of course, would make their own alternatives look much better.
Okay, so as the myth grew from a fringe theory into a full-blown geopolitical weapon, our institutions, they started to fight back. But, as we're about to see, the response was complicated, and it wasn't always a slam dunk.
Check this out. The UK's media regulator, Ofcom, shows just how tricky this is. When one TV presenter straight up misrepresented official health data, Ofcom found him in breach. Simple enough. But when another presenter talked about turbo cancer, he was cleared. Why? Because he framed it as his personal view. And that creates this massive opinion loophole, where you can say almost anything as long as you add the words, I believe, or in my opinion.
But that brings us to one of the tools that really does seem to work, hitting them in the wallet. After one of those presenters lost his court challenge against the regulator, a judge ordered him to pay £50,000 in legal costs. Now that sends a message. Spreading this stuff can be a very expensive hobby.
So here's the big takeaway from all this. Institutions learned a really valuable lesson. Instead of trying to police speech, which is incredibly difficult, it's way more effective to focus on actions and consequences. Medical boards started disciplining doctors not for what they said, but for what they did, like prescribing dangerous, unproven treatments. And courts started using their own rules to shut down endless, baseless lawsuits and slap people with huge legal bills.
And you can see why they had to shift strategies. There was this attempt in California to pass a law against medical misinformation, but the courts blocked it. The judge basically said that the term scientific consensus is too vague, because science is always evolving. So that legal roadblock forced everyone back to the same strategy. You don't police the words, you police the harmful conduct.
All right, we've dissected the myth, we've watched it go viral, and we've seen the institutional pushback. But after all of that noise, the actual science, the real data, reveals a final, dramatic, and completely unexpected twist in the story. Because this is where the whole story just gets turned on its head. While this entire myth was exploding online, claiming the vaccines cause cancer, real data from actual patients was telling a completely different and, frankly, an astonishing story.
Okay, just look at this. This is from a study of lung cancer patients who are all receiving immunotherapy. The 3-year survival rate for the unvaccinated patients was just under 31%, but for the vaccinated patients, it was almost 56%. That is a massive, almost unbelievable difference.
And just so we're clear, this wasn't some statistical fluke. The researchers controlled for everything, 39 different factors like age, cancer stage, general health. And even after all that, vaccination was still linked to a 49% lower risk of death for this group. That is a profound survival advantage.
So what on earth is going on? The leading theory is something they're calling the immune flare. Basically, the vaccine triggers this huge, short-term, system-wide alarm in your body. And for some patients, that alarm is enough to break through the camouflage of certain tumors, what they call cold tumors, suddenly making them visible and vulnerable to attack by both the body's own immune system and immunotherapy drugs.
And it gets even more specific. A study of melanoma patients with those notoriously hard-to-treat cold tumors found that vaccination was linked to a nearly 5-fold improvement in survival. So the ultimate irony here is that far from causing cancer, the vaccine's powerful immune-boosting effect might actually help some patients fight it. So let's just recap the whole wild journey. We started with a myth: vaccines cause turbo cancer. We discovered the reality: a baseless claim built on fear, amplified by our technology, and weaponized for political gain. And we ended with the data, that for some cancer patients, that very same vaccine appears to give them a significant life-saving advantage. This whole journey from myth to data leaves us with one last really important question. If a story that is provably, demonstrably false can be engineered to be this powerful, what does that mean for us? It forces us to ask, how do we build an immune system for our own minds to protect us from the next viral myth? And how do we navigate a world where the most compelling stories are so often the least true?